January 17, 1940. Augsburg, Germany. Snow drifts quietly across the courtyard of the Messerschmitt design facility. Inside, the air smells of metal filings and hot oil. German engineers in grey coats gather around a table, scattered with blueprints, not of a German aircraft but a foreign one. Someone slides a photograph across the surface. An American bomber, its thick fuselage gleaming beneath the Seattle sun. Flying Fortress, the caption reads. 4 engines. A hull so broad it looks almost absurd. A few engineers laugh. One mutters that the Americans have built a flying barn. Another wagers it will never survive a flak burst, let alone the Luftwaffe. To them, America is a land of overbuilt machines and cinematic dreams, not a power that understands real war. Outside, the Luftwaffe dominates Europe's skies. Inside this room, confidence feels unshakable. But far across the Atlantic, in quiet hangars along Puget Sound, the hum of engines is beginning, a sound that will one day echo across Europe's cities, not as a boast, but as a warning. The laughter in Augsburg will fade, and the sky will remember who mocked the fortress. In 1940, Germany stood at the height of its military power. Within months, the Blitzkrieg had crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. The Luftwaffe, sleek, aggressive, and meticulously trained, ruled the skies over Europe. Its aircraft, from the nimble Biro 109 to the fearsome Stuka dive bomber, embodied precision and speed. To the German High Command, air power was not about endurance, it was about decisive moments. Short, violent blows that shattered the enemy's will before they could react. Strategic bombing, the idea of destroying an enemy's industry and morale from the sky, seemed wasteful to them, a dream for slower, less efficient nations. The Luftwaffe's doctrine, crafted by figures like General Walther Wever and Ernst Udet, emphasized close air support. Aircraft were extensions of the army, not independent instruments of destruction. Why spend hours flying deep into enemy territory when victory could be achieved through blitzkrieg in days? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched with mixed fascination and dread. The war still felt far away. The Atlantic Ocean served as both shield and illusion. Yet, in the offices of the Army Air Corps, a small group of officers were planning for a kind of war no one else believed in. One fought from the sky with machines that could carry the weight of an entire nation's industry on their wings. The 1930s had not been kind to military budgets in America. The Great Depression starved innovation, but one company, Boeing, refused to accept stagnation. Their engineers envisioned something audacious. A 4-engine bomber capable of flying over 2,000 miles, carrying a payload of bombs with pinpoint precision. In 1935, they built a prototype, the Model 299, a machine of aluminum and ambition. During its first flight, journalists marveled at its size. One called it a flying fortress, a nickname Boeing quickly embraced. The concept baffled many. Why would any nation need such a massive aircraft? Most military planners favored smaller, twin-engine bombers. Even within the U.S. Army Air Corps, there were doubts. The Fortress seemed impractical, too costly, too complex. When the prototype crashed during testing at Wright Field, critics saw it as proof that the dream was over. But dreams have a strange persistence when fueled by fear. By 1939, as war consumed Europe, American strategists began rethinking everything. They studied the German advance and realized something terrifying. No nation could withstand a modern air assault without an equal response. The age of mass production and mechanized warfare demanded machines that could endure, not just fight, but outlast. In secret, the B-17 program continued. Boeing refined the design, strengthening its frame, arming its sides, and perfecting the Norden bombsight, a gyroscopic marvel that promised to hit targets from 6 miles high. Each new variant came closer to perfection. Back in Germany, few paid attention. To them, America was still the land of Hollywood, not Hiroshima. They mocked the idea of an air war fought by faceless bombers. The German press dismissed U.S. aviation as industry without discipline. Even Goering, the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe, claimed that no enemy bomber will ever reach the Ruhr. But beneath that arrogance lay ignorance. Germany's air strategy was built for short wars. America's vision was for long ones. While German factories worked around the clock to supply the Blitzkrieg, the Americans built an assembly line civilization. Steel from Pittsburgh, aluminum from Washington State, rubber from the South, all converged into a network of production unmatched in history. By late 1941, as the Pacific erupted in flames and the US entered the war, the Flying Fortress was ready. It was no longer a prototype or a curiosity. It was a weapon of ideology, the embodiment of a nation that believed endurance, not aggression, would decide the outcome of modern war. In Europe, German engineers still laughed at the thought. Their bombers had conquered Warsaw, London, and Rotterdam. They believed their skies untouchable. But across the Atlantic, American crews were training in formation flying, learning to weave invisible shields of overlapping firepower like a fortress in motion. The air war of the future was already coming, and it would not arrive quietly. When the first B-117s crossed the Atlantic in 1942, they carried not just bombs, but an idea that wars could be won from the sky by endurance and precision, not by speed and terror. The crews who flew them were young, often barely 20 years old. They arrived in Britain with the 8th Air Force, a force still forming its identity amid the rain and mud of East Anglia. Their bases, Alconbury, Bassingbourn, Thurley would soon become the heartbeat of daylight bombing over Europe. The British had already tried their hand at strategic bombing, and they had paid dearly for it. RAF Bomber Command's early raids on Germany had shown how vulnerable unescorted bombers were. By night, the British lost aircraft to searchlights and flak. By day, they lost them to the Luftwaffe's claws. When the Americans arrived and announced they would bomb in daylight, trusting their precision bomb sight and tight defensive formations, the British thought it madness. But madness can sometimes become doctrine when wrapped in confidence and steel. The first American raid over occupied Europe took place on August 17, 1942, targeting the railway marshalling yards at Rouen, France. 12 B-117s of the 97th Bomb Group took off from Polebrook. Among them was a pilot named Paul Tibbets, a name that would later echo across history for another mission, another bomb, another city. The raid was a modest success, but symbolically it marked the beginning of a new phase of war. The German response was cautious at first. Intelligence officers noted the aircraft's unusual formation flying and heavy defensive armament, 1350 caliber machine guns, arranged to cover almost every angle. Luftwaffe interceptors were used to pouncing on unescorted bombers, but the fortress turned the air battle into a storm of lead. The first German pilots who attacked the formations were stunned by the density of fire. Reports described the air around the bombers as a wall of tracers. Still, early missions revealed weaknesses. Bombing accuracy from high altitude was difficult in European weather. The crews lacked experience, and losses began to mount as missions penetrated deeper into German-controlled territory. Yet every loss only hardened the resolve of the men who flew them, and the engineers who built them. Inside Germany, the air war seemed far away in 1942. Berlin's cafes were still full. Factories hummed. The war in Russia consumed headlines. But somewhere in the background, faint echoes began to reach the homeland. Distant rumbles of air raid sirens, the whine of approaching engines. The Luftwaffe's own intelligence units began cataloguing wreckage from downed American bombers. What they found puzzled them. These machines were overbuilt, layered with armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant systems. Even when torn apart, they often limped home on one or two engines. At first, German engineers still sneered at the excess. The fortress, they said, was proof of American waste. Heavy, inefficient, lumbering. But the data began to tell a different story. One report from the Luftwaffe's technical office in 1943 described the B-17 as an aircraft designed not merely to fight, but to survive. That survival, multiplied by thousands, would soon define the American strategy. In the United States, production was accelerating at an unimaginable scale. Boeing plants in Seattle, Lockheed Vega in California, and Douglas in Oklahoma churned out bombers with conveyor belt precision. Women filled the assembly lines, riveting panels and welding frames. Every few hours, a new fortress rolled off the line, polished, tested, and flown to the front. The hum of the four Wright Cyclone engines became a symbol of industrial faith. Soldiers called it the heartbeat of the arsenal. That sound would soon echo over the Ruhr, the heart of Germany's war industry: steel mills, coal plants, oil refineries. By early 1943, the Luftwaffe began to understand that the Americans were not testing the skies. They were preparing to conquer them. Goering's boast that no enemy bomber would reach German soil was about to be tested. The fortresses were coming in greater numbers, flying higher, farther, and deeper with each mission. For now, Germany's engineers still believed in their superiority. The Mayars and Nines, the Faure 90s, the Flak Towers, and the iron resolve of the Reich. But deep within their confidence, a quiet unease was forming. The Americans had built a machine that refused to die easily, and soon the laughter in design rooms would be replaced by the thunder of engines above German cities. Engines that carried not just bombs, but the industrial heartbeat of democracy itself. At its core, the B-17 was not just a machine, it was a system of belief. Every rivet, every gun turret, every patch of armor was a statement about endurance. Where the Germans prized efficiency and speed, the Americans invested in survivability, in the idea that strength came not from perfection but from persistence. The human angle. The men who flew the Flying Fortress were not seasoned veterans. Most were young boys from Kansas farms, Chicago streets, and California colleges. They trained quickly, learned fast, and then found themselves in a cockpit at 25,000 feet, where frost formed on their masks and flak burst like black flowers in the air. They called themselves crew, but in truth they were something more. A small republic of 10 men in aluminum armor, each with a role, each dependent on the others for survival. The pilot, the bombardier, the navigator, the gunners, all working in rhythm, trusting that their fortress could hold against the storm. When they climbed into their aircraft before dawn, they often carried small tokens, photographs, folded letters, St. Christopher Medal. The missions could last 8 hours, sometimes longer. Once over enemy territory, they would fly straight and level, even as German fighters screamed through their formations. There was no evasive maneuvering. The doctrine was precision, stability over chaos. For them, courage wasn't in shooting back. It was in not flinching, holding steady while the sky turned black with shrapnel, believing that the machine would hold, even as metal ripped and engines caught fire. The bond between crewmen was wordless and absolute. If a man didn't return, his bunk was left untouched for days. They would sit in silence, staring at the empty space where laughter used to live. For them, the Flying Fortress was both protector and prison, a symbol of hope and an iron cage of fear. The technological angle. Technologically, the B-117 was a marvel of layered innovation. Its 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines gave it range, power, and resilience. Each was fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks to resist fire. The fuselage was reinforced with aluminum alloy ribs, giving the airframe the strength to limp home with holes large enough to crawl through. The plane's defensive system was revolutionary, a network of 1350 caliber Browning machine guns mounted to cover nearly every approach angle, from the chin turret to the tail gun, from the dorsal and ball turrets to the waist positions. No part of the sky went unwatched. Then came the Norden bomb sight, a small gyroscopic marvel hidden beneath glass. It allowed bombardiers to calculate wind, altitude, and speed to strike within a few hundred feet of their targets. It was so secret that crews swore oaths to destroy it if captured. But technology alone didn't make the fortress fear. What made it powerful was the way its design encouraged formation flying, a new kind of aerial discipline. Dozens of aircraft would fly in tight geometric formations overlapping their fields of fire, creating a collective defense that mirrored the democratic ideal, protection through unity. No single bomber could survive alone, but together they became an impenetrable web of steel and determination. It was a philosophy of war translated into engineering, Not the fastest, not the sleekest, but the most enduring. A mirror of the nation that built it. The tactical angle. From the first days over France to the later raids into Germany, the Americans clung to one guiding principle: daylight precision bombing. Where the British turned to night raids accepting the chaos of darkness, the US Army Air Forces believed in daylight, in seeing the target, striking it, and proving that accuracy could end a war faster than annihilation. But daylight meant danger. The enemy could see them coming. Fighters could swarm. Flak batteries could trap. Every mission became a deadly test of doctrine. In 1943, missions into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, turned the sky into a furnace. Fortresses flew through walls of flak, so thick it seemed you could walk on it. Crews watched planes vanish in mid-air, shredded by cannon fire. Yet those who survived brought back photographs, clear, sharp, undeniable evidence that bombs had struck their mark. Each photograph was more than proof of success. It was validation of a belief system, that endurance, discipline, and precision could overcome speed, fear, and rage. German engineers, watching from their factories, began to study the wreckage that fell to earth. They couldn't understand how these planes could sustain so much damage and still return home. Some came back missing entire tails. Others landed with holes large enough to crawl through. One fortress flew over 400 miles with a dead pilot at the controls, guided home by its co-pilot and faith in the machine. Each returning aircraft was a message: you can wound us, but you cannot break us. For the Germans, that was more than a military problem. It was a psychological one. Every fortress that limped back across the channel was another crack in the illusion of invincibility. The Luftwaffe was beginning to face something it had not truly known before, an enemy that fought not for domination but for persistence. And that persistence was just beginning to reveal what it could do. For the Luftwaffe, 1943 was supposed to be a year of control. Their fighters still owned the skies from the Channel to the Vistula. Their pilots were veterans, men who had crushed the RAF in the early Blitz and torn through Soviet formations in the east. But when the B-17s arrived in numbers, something began to change. German pilots found themselves facing an opponent that didn't behave the way they expected. These bombers did not scatter when attacked. They did not dive away or break formation. They held their course, flying through bursts of black smoke as if blind to danger. Veteran aces like Egon Meyer and Adolf Galland studied their tactics. Meyer, commanding JG-2, was among the first to devise the head-on attack, a frontal assault that exploited the fortress's weak forward arc before the addition of the chin turret. It worked, but only briefly. Each innovation on the German side was answered by a new countermeasure from the Americans: armor plates, gun positions, better coordination. As the raids deepened over Bremen, Kiel, and the Ruhr, the air war became a duel of endurance. German factories worked feverishly to produce enough fighters and ammunition to meet the constant waves. Yet even as they shot down dozens, the sky filled again the next morning. Pilots began to speak in whispers. They have no... For the first time, the Luftwaffe was facing not just an enemy force, but an enemy system. The Americans were not fighting for territory or prestige. They were fighting to exhaust the German economy itself, and the fortress was their instrument. The industrial angle. While German engineers refined every design, seeking efficiency through perfection, the Americans sought power through scale. At its peak, the United States produced a new B-17 every 90 minutes. Boeing plants in Seattle and Renton, Lockheed Vega in Burbank, and Douglas in Tulsa became temples of modern industry. The assembly lines moved 24 hours a day, lit by floodlights that turned night into day. It was a production rhythm Germany could not match. In Germany, every aircraft was a work of craftsmanship, meticulously assembled by skilled hands. In America, it was a symphony of parts and labor. Women in coveralls fastened rivets with pneumatic hammers. Men in denim guided fuselages along rail. Trains carried engines from Ohio, propellers from Massachusetts, and avionics from California. The entire continent had become a single breathing organism of war. Every hum of a B-17's engines carried within it the echo of 1,000 factories, 1,000 workers, 1,000 small acts of determination, and this more than armor or guns, terrified German planners. The Reich had built an empire on the myth of efficiency. But now their enemy had redefined what efficiency meant, not precision, but scale. As the bombers multiplied, the Reich's industrial heart began to tremble. Oil refineries in the Ruhr burned, ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt were shattered, rail lines, power stations, and submarine pens were crippled. For every city that burned, a new fortress took flight. For every bomber that fell, two more arrived. It was mathematics, brutal, relentless mathematics. And in those equations, Germany was losing. The moral angle. Yet behind every equation lay a question that no engineer could answer. What did it mean to destroy a city from the sky? The flying fortress was built to fight industry, not people. Its doctrine promised precision bombing, striking only factories, oil depots, and military installations. But precision, in theory, rarely survived the clouds of war. Winds drifted bombs miles off course. Smoke and haze obscured target each time the bomb bay doors opened. A line blurred between soldier and civilian, between necessity and destruction. In Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah in 1943, American and British bombers turned the city into a sea of fire. Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. Asphalt melted, sucking the living and the dead alike into flame. Survivors described the sound of the wind, a storm of oxygen feeding the inferno as if the air itself had turned against them. Some American airmen wept when they saw what their bombs had done. Others convinced themselves it was the only way to end the war. Above the clouds, the world was abstract, maps, grids, and coordinates, but below, reality screamed. The Germans called the bombers Terrorflieger, terror flyer. To them, the fortress was not a machine of democracy, but a herald of apocalypse. Propaganda posters showed the B-17 as a monster in the sky, devouring cities, but the truth was more complex. The fortress had become a paradox, a symbol of both human ingenuity and human devastation. It carried not just bombs, but ideology. Each mission declared that democracy could be industrial, organized, and merciless, when pushed to the edge. For the German engineers who once laughed at its design, the irony was bitter. The plane they had mocked as clumsy and inefficient was now erasing the very factories where their laughter once echoed. And as the war dragged on, the engineers stopped laughing altogether. They began working in the cold, beneath bomb-shattered roofs, building weapons they knew would never come fast enough. The fortress had done more than damage their cities. It had broken their faith in technology, in superiority, and in the illusion of control. The sound of its engines had become the sound of inevitability, and that sound was growing louder. By mid-1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal contest of endurance. The Americans believed they could cripple Germany's industrial heart through daylight precision raids. The Germans believed they could bleed the sky dry. The truth lay somewhere between, in clouds of smoke, fire, and twisted aluminum. The summer of 1943 brought the test that would define both doctrines. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The targets were not cities, but veins, ball-bearing factories, and aircraft plants that fed the entire German war machine. Without them, tanks would seize, aircraft would fail, and production would grind to a halt. But the routes to these targets ran deep into enemy territory, far beyond the reach of Allied fighter escorts. The men who flew them knew the odds. Once they crossed the Rhine, they were alone. The morning of the raid, August 17, 1943, before dawn, hundreds of airmen stood in the damp chill of East Anglia's airfields. The smell of coffee and engine oil mingled in the dark. Pilots studied maps by red light, tracing the long path into Bavaria. Mechanics moved along the runways, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, whispering quiet prayers to the machines. The fortress crews called their aircraft by names: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Argals, Painted Girls, Dice, and Lucky Charms adorned the noses, reminders of home and humanity, in a war that was fast losing both. At 080 hours, the engines thundered to life. Across England, entire villages stopped to watch as formation after formation climbed into the pale morning sky. 376 Biro 17s rose into the sunlight, their silver bodies glinting like a migrating storm. Crossing into the inferno, over the North Sea, condensation trails stitched the sky. Once they reached enemy territory, flak began to bloom, black puffs marking the invisible perimeter of German defense. The bombers held steady, flying in their rigid combat boxes, machine guns ready. Then came the fighters. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf 2-9s and Focke-Wulf 90s tore through the formations, firing 20mm cannons into the bombers' bellies and wings. The fortress guns replied in unison, a thunderous chorus of .250 caliber fire. The air turned into chaos, burning oil, spinning metal, parachutes drifting against a blood-red sky. Entire bombers vanished in flashes of flame. Others flew on with holes the size of doors in their fuselages, their crews still firing. By the time the Regensburg group reached its target, it had been fighting for over 3 hours. Yet they stayed on course. Bomb bay doors opened, bombs fell, a slow, deliberate rain. Below, the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg erupted in fire. Photographs taken later showed the plant gutted, assembly lines reduced to ash. But there was no rest. Instead of returning home, the Regensburg group continued south, across the Alps, bound for North Africa where they would land and refuel. The second wave, bound for Schweinfurt, pressed deeper into German Schweinfurt. The cost of belief. The city of Schweinfurt, in northern Bavaria, was the heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry. Every tank tread, every aircraft propeller, every moving machine in the Reich relied on its production. Destroy it, and the war could stall. But the Germans knew its importance. As the bombers approached, the flak thickened into a storm. One gunner later wrote, "It looked like we were flying into a wall made of smoke and fire." Wave after wave of B-17s pressed through. The Norden bomb sites locked onto targets. Bombs whistled down, bursting through roofs, turning steel presses into molten wreckage. The Germans on the ground watched in disbelief, factories they thought untouchable crumbling before their eyes. But victory had a price. Of the 36 bombers that took off, 60 were shot down. Nearly 1 in 6, over 550 airmen were killed or captured. Many more limped back with engines out, landing in shattered pieces on English fields. Some aircraft had to be cut open to retrieve the wounded. Ground crews wept as they counted the holes. Some planes carried over 500, yet those that returned became legends. Mechanics taped over every scar like a badge of honor. The men called them ghost ships that refused to die. The losses were staggering. Even American commanders questioned whether daylight bombing was sustainable. But the photographs told another story. Schweinfurt was burning. Production would take months to recover. The factories were crippled. The moment everything changed for the Germans, the raids were revelation. The laughter that had filled their design rooms in 1940 was gone. Now they worked by candlelight in bombed-out factories, drafting blueprints for interceptor jets that could no longer be built fast enough. For the Americans, the raids marked a transformation from theory to conviction. The Flying Fortress had proven that courage and steel could reach deep into enemy territory, even when outnumbered and unescorted. Yet it also revealed a truth that no one wanted to admit. Courage alone could not win the air war. The cost was too high, the losses too severe. The fortress could survive almost anything, but not forever. In the months that followed, the daylight raids slowed. Commanders waited for something the fortress desperately needed: a guardian, a new kind of escort that could stay with them all the way to Germany and back. It would come soon in the sleek shape of the P-51 Mustang, but before that the skies would darken again, and the air war would reach its breaking point. The fortress had proven its worth. Now it had to prove its endurance. Winter 1943 gave way to a grim dawn over Europe. The Americans had learned hard lessons, that courage could not replace reach, and armor could not outfly speed. But by early 1944, a new sound began to echo above the clouds, the deep, confident hum of the P-51 Mustang. It was sleek, fast, and elegant, everything the B-17 was not. Its long-range fuel tanks allowed it to follow the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Pilots called it the bomber's shadow, because wherever a fortress flew, a Mustang soon appeared beside it, silent, watchful, lethal. For the first time, the flying fortress was not alone, and that changed everything. The return to the heart of Germany. On February 20, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week. Its goal was nothing less than the destruction of the German aircraft industry. Day after day, wave after wave, the fortresses filled the sky, escorted now by their sleek protectors. The Germans met them with everything they had: Biro ZAT-19s, F-190s, flak batteries, even the experimental Mir-40 Sen heavy fighters. But this time, they were met not just with defensive fire from the bombers. The Mustangs dove in from the sun, tearing through the Luftwaffe formations. Airfields burned, hangars collapsed, assembly plants vanished in cascades of smoke. German pilots who once bragged about hunting fortresses now found themselves hunted instead. For the first time, Allied commanders could see the shift in numbers. The Luftwaffe was breaking. Its elite pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The fortress as the spear of the West. With air superiority shifting, the B-17 became something more than a machine of war. It became the spearhead of ideology. Each mission was not just about bombs or targets, but about the very question of dominance. Could a free nation outproduce, outfight, and outendure a regime built on fear? From their bases in England, the bombers launched almost daily. The sky above the North Sea became a conveyor belt of silver wings. Civilians in German cities began to hear a new rhythm of war, a deep, distant rumble that grew until it filled the heaven. Children called it Der Donner aus Westen, the thunder from the west, and every time it came, another piece of the Reich vanished beneath fire and rubble. Berlin, the fortress over the capital. By March 1944, the Americans dared what had once been unthinkable: daylight raids over Berlin itself. To the German people, the capital had always been untouchable, the very heart of the Reich. But on March 6, the fortresses came, 600 strong, stretching across the horizon. Over the radio, Luftwaffe controllers could hardly believe the reports. The enemy is over Berlin in daylight. Fighter squadrons scrambled, but the Mustangs were waiting. German ace after ace fell that day, men who had flown since the Battle of Britain. On the ground, Berliners watched in disbelief as sunlight vanished behind the bombers' shadows. Then the sound came, that deep, endless growl of engines, followed by the steady whistle of falling bombs. The city shook. Smoke rose in pillars visible from 30 miles away. What began as disbelief turned to silence, and then to dread. The death of the Luftwaffe. By mid-1944, the air war was no longer a duel. It was an extermination. The Americans called it the Great Air Offensive. Every major industrial city in Germany, Hamburg, Leipzig, Cologne, Dresden, felt the weight of the fortress wings. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been gutted. Its pilots, many now barely trained boys, faced overwhelming odds. Records from the German Air Ministry in June 1944 reveal the collapse in plane numbers. Over 1,700 fighter aircraft lost in a single month. Factories could not replace them. Fuel reserves dwindled. The Reich had built walls of steel and ideology, but it had not prepared for an enemy that could blot out the sun. One German general later wrote, "The Americans did not defeat us with speed or cunning. They defeated us with abundance, the kind that never ends." That word, abundance, became the symbol of the fortress itself. Each bomber carried not just bombs but the weight of American industry, the assembly lines, the factories, the workers who built them by the thousand. The steady sound of the B-17's engines, 4 Wright Cyclone radials pounding in rhythm, came to represent something larger than power. It was the sound of a nation that refused to tire, the fire that consumed the war. By late 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France and the final drive into Germany, the skies were already won. Entire cities glowed at night with the fires of bombardment. Bridges collapsed, rail yards melted, fuel depots vanished. In December, during the Battle of the Bulge, when the weather cleared, the fortresses returned again, flying low, cutting off German supply lines, striking armor columns. Even the snow couldn't silence them. Everywhere they flew, they carried the same message. This war would not end in negotiation, but in surrender. The silence after the storm. When the raids finally ceased in 1945, the numbers told the story. Over 290,000 sorties by flying fortresses, nearly 1.5 million tons of bombs dropped, tens of thousands of airmen lost, yet hundreds of thousands of civilians saved by the war's accelerated end. In the ruins of once mighty German factories, twisted steel still bore the marks of the fortress's bombs, and in those same ruins captured German engineers, the same men who had once mocked the American design, studied the fragments in silence. What they saw was not crude construction or excess, it was precision, balance, and endurance. The laughter of 1940 had long since burned away. In its place was respect and fear. The fortress had done what no one believed possible. It had carried democracy on its wings across oceans and over empires, and delivered it in thunder. In the spring of 1945, when the war finally drew its ragged breath, and the smoke began to lift from the ruins of Europe, the skies were silent once more. No contrails traced the heavens. No bombers droned above the clouds. The endless sound that had filled the world for 5 long years faded into memory. But somewhere in that silence, the rhythm of 4 engines still seemed to echo, steady, patient, eternal. The flying fortress had done its duty. From the first tentative missions over France to the great infernos over Germany, it had carried not just bombs but the burden of belief that a free people, separated by oceans, could build a weapon strong enough to preserve liberty itself. Its story was never just about destruction. It was about endurance, about a machine born from doubt, ridiculed by enemies, and tested by fire, yet one that refused to break. Each rivet on its skin told the story of a nation that built more than machines. America built faith into metal. To the men who flew it, the fortress was not only a weapon but a companion. Crews gave them names: Memphis Belle 909, Hell's Angels, Ye Old Pub. They painted faces, wrote letters on the fuselage, treated them like living beings. For those few hours over Europe, inside the storm of flak and fire, the fortress was their world, a fragile bubble of humanity surrounded by chaos, and in that world, they learned something profound, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep flying anyway. The symbol of abundance. If there was one symbol that defined the fortress, it was its engines, 4 throbbing hearts of power, each turning in perfect rhythm. The Germans heard them before they saw them, a deep, pulsing sound that filled the air like the beat of an approaching storm. That sound came to mean something larger. It was the hum of production lines in Seattle and Wichita. It was the rhythm of liberty found in industry, of workers who built so many engines, so many planes, that no loss could stop the tide. The Luftwaffe fought with brilliance, but brilliance cannot outlast abundance. Every fortress lost was replaced by another. Every pilot fallen was followed by a new one, trained and ready. Behind each bomber was a network of unseen hands, mechanics, welders, women riveting metal in factories, farmers supplying the fuel of industry. Together they built a force so vast that even tyranny could not match it. And that, perhaps, was the true genius of the fortress, not its armor or firepower, but what it represented. It was democracy in motion, imperfect, massive, relentless. Ashes and understanding. When the German cities finally lay in ashes, the engineers who had once mocked the American design walked through the wreckage of their own factories. Some stood in silence before the twisted beams of burned-out hangars, staring at the fragments of bombs that had fallen from 6 miles above. One Luftwaffe officer later wrote in his memoirs, "We thought their machines were built by amateurs. Too heavy, too crude. We were wrong. They built them to last longer than war itself." For Germany, the air war was a lesson written in fire, that the future belonged not to those who conquered quickly, but to those who endured completely. And for America, it was the moment the nation's industrial heart revealed its full power. The war had transformed assembly lines into arteries of freedom. The same hands that once built cars and refrigerators now forged bombers and engines, and in doing so they built the world's greatest arsenal of democracy. Legacy beyond the clouds. After the war, the fortresses came home. Some were scrapped, melted down to build a peacetime world. Others were used for search and rescue, mapping, even weather reconnaissance. But wherever they flew, they carried ghosts, the echoes of those who never returned. In the following decades, new aircraft would rise, jets that could cross oceans in hours, bombers that carried weapons 1,000 times more powerful, yet none ever carried the same spirit. Because the B-17 was more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of transformation, the moment when a free nation learned how to fight, not just with might, but with meaning. The final flight. Today a handful of fortresses still fly, restored by volunteers and veterans' descendants. When their engines start, people stop and look to the sky. The sound is old, but familiar, deep, rumbling, alive. It carries with it memories of courage, loss, and victory, of a generation that faced the darkness and refused to let it win. And as that sound fades into the horizon, one truth remains clear. Freedom is not given. It is built, piece by piece, rivet by rivet, wing by wing, by those willing to bear the weight of their ideals. The flying fortress bore that weight, and in doing so it turned laughter into silence, arrogance into ashes, and war into a lesson the world would never forget.